When I was in my early 20s, I used to take part in a lot of mass mobilizations. It was the era of giant puppets and paper mache. On the streets of Seattle, Chicago, or say Washington, D.C., it was not uncommon to find massive figurines, sometimes requiring a whole team of people to maneuver them, lumbering down the pavement, serving as nodes in a river of dissent. There, Mother Earth in a battle with the monopoly banker. There, a caricature of the president. There, a course of masked dancers representing solar power spin and bop in an epic duel with fossil fuel. There, the range of puppets was only limited by the imagination of the puppeteers and the target of outrage. Creative interpretations of what best symbolized the anti-war, pro-labor, or ecological movements abounded. Each hinted at the absurd possibility that the world might yet be turned upside down, that there was more love and justice somewhere. Each offered a story in which peace was coming to reign in a planet filled with violence. Each suggested that hatred could be overcome with compassion, and that the earth might yet escape ecological devastation. I suspect that a few of you participated in some of those mobilizations, and I imagine that many of you saw images of them on the television screen, the internet, or in those bygone days, the print media. If you observed such events from the distance of news coverage, you probably missed that the giant puppets were connected to or accompanied by acts of street theater. One of my favorites was a group who titled themselves the Groucho Marxists. Their routine was basically like it sounds. Clowns dressed in the style of Groucho Marx, with black smeared on mustaches, wired glasses, rumpled classic suits, and uncoordinated ties, ran around making statements and handing out slips of paper with quotations from both of the Marxes. From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. These are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others. The whole experience was surreal, absurd, foolish. But that was the point, to disrupt the ordinary and suggest that the impossible is actually possible. I suspect that you've had similar experiences in a different venue. If you've ever been to the circus, you're certainly familiar with the tiny car from which out rolls the clowns, infinitely unfolding, pulling out long, do they ever end, bouquets of tissue flowers, and bouncing around in those ridiculous shoes. Puppets, street theater, clowns. I offer you this panoply of images as an atypical entry into our Easter reflections. God made the wisdom of the world look foolish, claims a Christian text. I believe because it is absurd, a statement widely misattributed to the early Christian North African theologian Tertullian. I think of such words at this time of year when I, the fairly rationalist Unitarian Universalist minister, get called on to preach the Easter sermon. I believe because it is absurd. The thing that Tertullian never actually said can be taken as the summit of anti-rationalist religion. It referred to the literal resurrection of Jesus, a religious story that I suspect most, if not almost all, Unitarian Universalists have trouble taking totally seriously. I believe because it is absurd, there's something, though, about the words that speak to me of the essence of faith. They remind me of the truth that so often, when things seem difficult or impossible, there still remains a chance that they can be different. We Unitarian Universalists have a long tradition of focusing on the life rather than the death of Jesus, as Carol reminded the kids earlier. This, of course, always leaves us somewhat confused come Easter. If there is no resurrection of the dead, then what is the point of the holiday? I take it as an opportunity to recall that Jesus, as encountered through the text labeled as dissident or heretical, taught something I like to call the resurrection of the living. When asked who he was, the Buddha is said to have replied, "I am awake." Jesus provided a similar teaching when asked about the resurrection. It is truth standing firm. It is revelation of what is, the transformation of things, and a transition into freshness. The revelation of what is. Faith is, in part, the understanding that it is possible to make a way out of no way. The revelation of what is, the resurrection of the living, sometimes simply revolves around waking up to the reality that the future is unwritten, nothing is constant, and there is always an outside chance that even in our most difficult moments, things could be different. That in these days when the politics of cruelty seem to run rampant across the country, love might yet overcome hate. That love might overpower the anti-LGBTQ legislation sweeping the country. That love might call into the hearts of the white supremacists who expelled the legislatures from Tennessee's House to have a transformation and see the world differently and dedicate themselves to democracy rather than its destruction. That everywhere it might yet be possible to see a reign of peace and justice. In such reflections, I have benefited in my years from knowing clowns, holy and blessed fools. Stories from two come to me this morning. There was Oscard, who would appear seemingly from nowhere, and there was the man who just called himself stupid. An old labor organizer. I never actually met him, but I heard tales of his actions and his stupid wisdom from some of my own mentors. Oscard and stupid helped me to wake up to what is, to undergo the resurrection of the living, to better understand the absurdity of faith and trust that sometimes the impossible might yet become possible. Let us start with Oscard. She was better known as the Reverend K. Jorgensen, the longtime community minister of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco and co-founder of the Faithful Fools. A community minister, I should note, is different than a parish minister. Reverend Scott and I are parish ministers. We primarily serve a congregation, in our case, of course, the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. A community minister, in contrast, is someone whose ministry is principally through a community organization with the larger community. Typically, community ministers have a relationship with a congregation. They are members of a congregation and accountable to it, but they are not employed by it or responsible for things like leading the Sunday morning service or administering the campus. Kay was an unusual minister. She got ordained in her mid-50s. Now, some people run away from the church to join the circus, But Kay ran away from the circus to join the church. I mean, not really, but in her early years, she trained as a mime and spent the first part of her working life clowning. From her gently hilarious feats of pantomime, she learned that humor has the power to break down barriers and love can overcome much. It was something she tried to deploy to bring a new spirit into whatever religious community she entered. I remember coffee hours in San Francisco where she would welcome visitors who seemed uncomfortable with a spontaneous bit of miming. A clown nose might appear, and there was her persona Oscard, finding a quarter behind the ear of a nervous child, or faking a tumble and offering a grin. She could use her humor to great effect to change the tenor of a meeting. I remember being at one where she was present. We were debating some action that people in the community wanted to take. The precise subject was unimportant, though the general outline is that it involved establishing a nonprofit to serve the larger community. Now, I'm not sure why she was there, since community ministers typically don't attend such discussions. Whatever the case, the objective of the action was widely viewed as desirable, but well beyond the congregation's resources. The conversation grew heated. Kay just sat there saying nothing. The rationalists, the reasonable people in the room, insisted that the proposed plan of action was impossible. The more hopeful advocates insisted that it was not practical, but something that could be achieved. It appeared that an impasse had been reached. Tension filled the room. Finally, someone asked Kay for her opinion. She responded by quoting a line from the Blues Brothers. It's 106 miles to Chicago. We've got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes. It's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses. Expecting wise counsel rather than a non sequitur movie citation, everyone was confused. People started laughing, and asked to elaborate, she refused to say anything else. But somehow this changed the direction of the conversation, and the congregation then proceeded to vote on the action that they had just earlier said was almost impossible, and fund the nonprofit, which then went to spend more than a decade providing services to the community. Kay's chief ministry was with the Faithful Fools, organized with her longtime collaborator, the Sister Carmen Barsody. The Fools are a street ministry. They see their work as primarily bridging the divides that separate people. In all they do, they challenge people to ask a simple question: what keeps us separate? It is a question designed to spur the resurrection of the living, the waking up of what is. It is coupled with an embodied spiritual practice, which Kay and Carmen called street retreats. Now, many of us think of spiritual retreats as rarefied events. They take place in spaces outside of our ordinary lives and typically involve travel to spaces beyond where we regularly inhabit. Some of you, for instance, just joined Carol and myself and others for our annual spring retreat to U Bar U. Located outside of Kerrville, it is a rural oasis where it is possible to escape the rigid pressures of ordinary life. Work, school, even worrying about cooking a meal can be forgotten. There are wondrous stars at night, a trail filled with brambles and wildflowers, and ample opportunities for relaxed reflection. Street retreats are the opposite. They take place in familiar spaces and challenge participants to experience them in new ways. Rather than traveling to some far-off center in search of a spiritual awakening, participants are invited to walk the streets outside of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco for an afternoon, a day, or even a week. There are only two real rules to this. You're not allowed to spend any money, and for as long as you're on the retreat, you have to stay on the streets. That's it. Walk through the pavement, pay attention, talk to the people you encounter, and as you do, continually ask the question, what keeps us separate? The San Francisco Society, like the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston, is a center city congregation. The Bay Area has a particularly pronounced problem with housing. Tens of thousands of people live on the streets. Many of them live near the society. Being in the streets for any length of time means actually engaging with the unhoused. If you're going to eat without money, then you end up going through the same soup lines that those who are unhoused do. Kay even made it a practice of regularly sleeping on the streets herself. She was particularly fond of sleeping on the steps of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco. All the while, she and Carmen asked people to reflect on the question, what keeps us separate? The more the question is asked, the more the participants, in Kay's words, recognize ourselves waking up to an understanding that homelessness is an event, not a state of being. It is an event in time. Waking up to the reality that housed or unhoused, people are all more alike than we are different. Waking up to the truth that homelessness exists because of the vast structures of economic injustice that ensure housing is connected to employment, that demand that housing is provided only at a profit, and that you need to have wealth or income to have a home. Waking up to the reality that even in difficult spaces, there remains something of hope and something of beauty. Oscar always had the potential to appear with a clown's nose, a non sequitur, a strange routine. Waking up to the truth that love calls us to have housing for all and overcome hatred. What separates us? It's an absurdly simple question. Absurdly simple questions were the forte of Stupid. Before fleeing to Canada to escape imprisonment for his political beliefs, he had been an organizer with the Industrial Workers of the World, a radical labor union in the 19-teens and early 20s. The IWW, sometimes known as the Wobblies, believe that there's an inevitable conflict between employers and workers. They also practice radical democracy and seek to implement it both in their job and on their union, or in their union. Now, I used to organize with the IWW, and I've shared with some of you, from the pulpit, some of my experiences of workers implementing the union's philosophy. It revolves around direct action, the idea that the best way to solve a problem is to address it when it arises. A few months ago, I shared with you a story that was an example of this. Workers at a pizza place who began the practice of binning gloves when management refused to deal with a particular safety issue. You might recall that the workers at that restaurant were constantly burning themselves because management would not buy adequate oven gloves. Pretty simple issue. But they talked and talked and talked with management and got nowhere. Finally, they came up with this game of binning gloves. It was very simple. At the end of every shift, they checked the gloves, and if they were subpar, they would figure out who could get the gloves into the trash the fastest. Their manager would try to stop them and insist that they continue to use the unsafe gloves, but it's hard to monitor who is putting what in the trash and taking it out to the curb all the time. And at the end of a couple of shifts, the gloves were all so bad that they had to go. And pretty soon there came to a time when there were no gloves left. And so in order to keep the restaurant open, the managers had to rush out and buy a whole bunch of oven gloves right then and there. And that tactic worked. After that, there were always adequate safety gear, and people stopped getting burned a lot less. People stopped getting burned a lot. Stupid was one of the people who taught my mentors tactics like that. I was told that he always looked for the most obvious or direct solution to a problem, even if the solution seemed impossible. To a problem like gloves with holes, he would just suggest, well, why don't you throw them out? If he was told that his direct solution was impractical, his tactic was to reply, well, what do I know? I'm stupid. Part of what he taught was just to ask the people the question of why, and then offer them a space to reflect. When organizing a labor union, this might be the simple question of why do you work where you do? Why is your job unsafe? Why? And usually the retort, when the dead end or the uncomfortable answer had been reached, well, what do I know? I'm stupid. His stupid questions led him to be a font of wisdom, a constant encouragement to wake up to the world as it is, and a demand that we find more love somewhere. It filled him with sayings that challenged people to recognize the power structures that they are caught in, and see the world and its possibilities and its absurdities with which they live just a little bit differently. Most of these were really quite simple folk knowledge. He collected them in a series of pamphlets that were hand-printed and I was given and encouraged to study. They cover a range of things from politics to parenting. Brooks, streams, and rivers get very crooked because they follow the path of least resistance. Sometimes people do the same and with the same result. Children do need love and affection, and those who do the least to attract it are quite likely the ones who need it the most. Even the smallest task becomes impossible to those who are unwilling to try. Well, what do I know? I'm stupid. Giant puppets, the Groucho Marxists, Oscar the Clown, stupid. I have shared with you stories about them this Easter Sunday for two reasons. First, they reflect the message of Jesus as found in his life, not in his death. Second, they connect to the classical Unitarian understanding of Jesus, which we should recall whenever we encounter a Christian holiday. First, the message of Jesus. Jesus, as portrayed in the Gospels, was a rabble-rouser. He was always going around trying to turn the world upside down, chasing the moneylenders out of the temple, preaching the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. He challenged the greatest powers of his day, Imperial Rome, and called on people to wake up to the world as it was then, filled with both injustice and beauty and the ever possible chance that hatred might be overcome with love. He was, in his own day, a blessed fool. Rather than share stories about him this morning, I've told you about the blessed fools I have known. I've done this because the core of classical Unitarianism, which we do well to uplift this Easter morning, is that each of us contains within the likeness of God. It is the task of the religious community to help us uncover that likeness. And it is a likeness that is found when we have the faith to believe in the absurd, We're not asked to believe in the absurd as invoked incorrectly in those words credited to Tertullian, I believe because it is absurd, speaking of a literal resurrection. We are instead asked to believe in the absurd proposition, proven true by the actions of so many seekers of love and justice, that it is possible to make a way out of no way, and that each of us has the potential to wake up to the world as it really is and undergo the resurrection of the living. The resurrection. It is truth standing firm. It is the revelation of what is and the transformation of things and a transition into freshness. May we each experience through the lives of blessed fools and in our own lives something of the resurrection of the living and wake up to the world as it is. A world where we are called to ask and answer the question, what is it that separates us? A world where we know that we each have the possibility to bring more love and justice and beauty into the world. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.